Matlebe, and I am a research and advocacy officer at Judges Matter. And we have decided to convene this webinar, considering that the JSC interviews are taking place next week. And the interviews took place early April this year, as per usual. So there have been a lot of talk about the JSC and how it conducts its interviews. And this webinar aims at considering the issues that have been raised in the public and in general as well. And more specifically, the purpose of this webinar is to look at the issue of criteria applicable by the JSC and how it conducts its interviews. So we've got Mbegezeli Benjamin and Chris Oxtoby. Mbegezeli is from Judges Matter. Chris Oxtoby is from DGRU as well. And they will be facilitating the webinar. But we were hoping to have Advocate Mpofu SC, who is also a JSC commissioner, who is representing the General Counsel of the Bar. And unfortunately, we did not seem to be able to get hold of him, and we're not sure whether he will be joining in later or not. But we've also invited Professor Monet Olivier, who is an associate professor of law and practicing advocate in the Eastern Cape. We've got Mr. Dan Mafora, who is a research officer at CASAC. They will be contributing to this webinar, and we are hoping that it will be a fruitful webinar that will assist us in finding answers to the issues that have been raised in the public about the way in which the JSC conducts its interviews. I'll hand over to you, Mbex.
Thank you so much, Sikona. Well, the idea behind this was to have a debate, which would be facilitated by Alison, but she is committed with other business, and her voice also, I think, is not participating. So you're stuck with a poor substitute in me. But I'll try my best to facilitate a discussion. So the idea behind this, like Zikona said, was to try and tease out some of the issues relating to how the JSC conducts its interviews, and basically the burning issues that are in public right now. And what the format of the discussion will be that I will pose a series of questions to each of the panelists, and then based on their responses, we'll then have a discussion, and then we'll tease out the conversation as we go along. But it really is a free and open discussion, and we will not really be giving any presentations because we're trying to maximize the time that we have available and have as rich a discussion as we possibly can. So with that, I'd like to start with you, Dan. After the interviews that happened in April of 2021, which a lot of people were critical of, you as CASAC went to court. You challenged that process. Can you basically give us a summary of what the issues were in your court challenge, and what faults did you see in the JSC's interview process?
Sure. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the question, Vix. So when I joined CASAC, we had started talking about the April interviews and the way that they were conducted. And obviously at that point, we hadn't had, any insight into the private deliberations or anything else other than what happened on that day. But what we saw on that day was, I think, one of the most egregious forms of abdication of leadership by the JSC chair in how the interviews were conducted, but also just the proliferation of issues or concerns that were not necessarily relevant, or that were not at all relevant to the interview process itself. So the first thing was the questioning of some of the candidates, veered into, and not just candidates for the Constitutional Court, but in general, that whole week of interviews, what we saw was the relitigation of issues by the commissioners who had been, for example, litigants in matters where those judges sat, and questioned them quite rigorously about the basis of their decisions, and kind of trying to get them to a place where they say, where they would or could have been seen as being doubtful of the decisions that they made, or second guessing themselves. And we think obviously that is not the proper role of the JSC, that the JSC is not a platform for people, for commissioners to relitigate, to hash out some of these issues that had taken place where they themselves, those commissioners themselves, were litigants. But another thing as well was the general lack of direction of the interviews, where seemingly commissioners could ask any question that they wanted, but that was not specifically targeted at exploring the qualities of the candidate, exploring their experience, exploring their qualifications, and merely to one. And I think obviously the most egregious case was the interview, or at least two very egregious cases, was the interview of Judge Catherine Sitilwane and Judge Pile, where they were questioned about relationships that they had outside the judicial function. And in the case of Judge Pile, ambushed with questions about allegations that had never been put to them. And in the case of Judge Catherine Sitilwane, the same issue that was raised I think in the two sessions preceding the April sessions were raised again, and particular commissioners taking interest in kind of bringing these issues that she had explained previously over and over again in order, it seemed, to disqualify her. And so when we had initially asked for the transcripts of the interviews, when we were going through it, we saw that there was also an unevenness in how, or an uneven-handedness, if that's a word, in how the JSC dealt with some of the candidates. Some of the candidates had interviews that went on for 2-3 hours. Some of the candidates had interviews that went on only for 15 minutes. And when we had a look at the interviews and just how they were conducted, and then after the recommendations had been made, it was clear that those candidates who had the more difficult interviews were left off the shortlist, and those candidates who kind of cruised through the interviews were able, or were put forward in the JSC's recommendation to the president. And so that was where I think it started, or something was triggered to say, perhaps there might be something worth looking at here, perhaps there might be a flaw in the process. Why not try, bring a review application and test this out? And once we did that, we were able to get further information.
I want to stop you there, then. I'm sorry, there'll be a few interjections in this conversation. I hope you don't mind. But some of the issues that you raise are issues that were quite obvious, and a lot of us also sitting in the room were shocked by. But what do you say to someone who would say, look, how does this relate to criteria? And particularly, for example, an issue that the Chief Justice raised with Judge Pillay to say, and the way that the Chief Justice prefaced the question was that I've heard your responses to this question, and I wasn't going to deal with the issue, and that's the issue relating to Minister Gordhan, but I wasn't going to deal with the issue until you raised it in your answers. Now, can I just ask you, probe this issue with you? I would left it otherwise, but I needed to raise it based on your answers. Now, what do you say to people who are saying that CASAC is raising these issues and trying to shield the candidates from tackling difficult questions and wanting maybe a certain kind of question to be asked that they as CASAC would prefer? What would your response be?
Right. So, I mean, the first point is to make is that the Chief Justice prefaces his question, right, with this kind of disclaimer that he wouldn't have asked the question had it not been for Judge Pillay's answer. But it was obviously something that he had known, and it was something that, if it came out, would have been adverse or would have affected Judge Pillay's candidacy adversely. And so the question then becomes, well, why did you not bring it forward? Why, in the interest of transparency, not put it forward? Let everyone know that there might, or there is this particular issue or this particular incident that happened involving the judge, so that it may be ventilated and the judge is able to explain, herself properly. The problem with how the questioning proceeded was that because you don't have a set, clear, published criteria to guide the kinds of questions that commissioners can ask, the kind of questions that are geared towards identifying or identifying candidates that are suitable for these positions, you can, or interviews can kind of descend into the kind of, the kind of mudslinging, the kind of just irrational process that we saw the April 2021 process, that the April 2021 process was. And when you have criteria, you are able to beforehand, and as I said, there was a problem with how the interviews were chaired, in that the commissioners were kind of allowed free rein to ask any kind of question with, no one is saying the questions should not be rigorous. No one is saying the questions should not be robust, but we're saying the questions that you ask should be relevant to whether or not this person is suitable to be appointed as a constitutional court judge. How do you know if something is relevant? If you don't have criteria, if you don't have criteria that you're measuring these candidates against, if you don't have criteria that determines the contours or the limits of the kind of questions that you can put to the candidate, how do you know whether or not, how do you have control, basically? How do you have control? How do you chair? How do you steer the interviews? And so the lack of a criteria itself is a challenge and is perhaps even the foundation of the problems that we saw at the JSC interviews. So we can be cynical and say, oh, your candidate didn't make it or whatever, but who has control over that? The point is that the process itself is not, or was not, satisfactory, or did not meet the constitutional standard at all, and that was our primary concern.
Okay, and I want to bring in Mornay into the conversation. Mornay, some of the issues that Dan is identifying, including the unevenness of the time and the length of the interviews, are issues that you raised as far back as when you published your book in 2014, and they don't seem to have been addressed over the years. So my question to you, and in response, and I think I would benefit from your response to Dan, is do you see criteria as being the key issue in this? How would you how would you diagnose the problem that we saw in April and perhaps in previous interviews?
Monet, I think you are still muted. Let's see.
There we go. Now, can you hear me?
Yes, we can
yes.
hear you.
Let me preface my comments by saying that this interview round was the most disastrous in the JSC's history. It was also the most publicized of all the interview rounds. People had great expectations, expecting that it would be a display of good questions that would focus on the qualities of the candidates, their qualifications, and so on. And unfortunately, we were greatly disappointed. Now, the fundamental issue is that you cannot know who to appoint unless you have criteria in terms of which you appoint. Now, the constitutional criteria are clear, but they are very general. To simply say, well, you know, you need to be appropriately qualified and fit and proper, that's all fine and well, but these criteria need to be fleshed out. And the responsibility for that lies with the JSC. Now, as you know, and as the rest of the discussants know, there are the 1998 guidelines, essentially the 2010 guidelines, replicated the 1998 ones, which fleshes it out somewhat, but that is insufficient. We need some more detailed criteria in order to measure candidates' qualifications, their experience, etc., against that particular criteria in order to determine their suitability for appointment. The point is that there needs to be a rational link between the questions posed to candidates and these particular stipulated criteria. And unless you have the stipulated criteria, you cannot ask questions which then indicate the suitability or not of a candidate for appointment. The questions that were posed were completely, or a number of questions were completely unrelated to the suitability of a particular candidate for appointment. The JSC has specific questioning guidelines in this regard, saying that, you know, to the suitability of the candidate for appointment. And as was mentioned earlier, there were questions asked that were completely irrelevant to this question of suitability for appointment. And the role of the Chief Justice as chairperson here is absolutely vital. The chairperson is essentially the guardian, I would say, of the questioning guidelines. He is the one who must control proceedings. He is the one who must protect the candidates against inappropriate questions which infringe their reputations, their right to human dignity, their right to privacy, all of this bouquet of rights which even judges are entitled to, and also particularly in such a public domain. And specifically with regard to Judge Pillay, and then also to some extent with Wanlis SC, the issue with regard to allegations, serious allegations that relate to the reputation of the particular candidate, those need to be canvassed in advance. The questioning guidelines are clear that in fact the JSC needs to inform the candidate well in advance of these particular allegations in order for that candidate then to prepare a defense or a response, or to give that candidate then the opportunity to withdraw from the process. In the case of Wanlis SC, I mean, I think it was completely irregular then for some commissioners to say, well, you know, withdraw your candidacy. It's not for the commission to say withdraw your candidacy. It is for the candidate to decide whether or not to continue with that particular candidacy. And if he feels that he has a proper answer to the allegation, and he feels that he can answer to that allegation, then it is not for the JSC to say, but you know what, an allegation is sufficient in order to disqualify you from appointment. And that's a situation that we simply cannot have or cannot tolerate.
Thank you so much, Monet. Sorry, Mbex. I see that Advocate Dali Mpofu has joined us. Thank you so much, Advocate Dali Mpofu. We've got, just to brief you, we've got Mr. Olivier and Mr. Mafora, who are members of the panel, and we've got yourself in addition to them. Mbex is going to brief you as to what has been discussed in the few minutes that we have started the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, apologies. I was held up in a meeting with the Deputy Judge President.
Thank you for joining us, Advocate Mpofu. Zikona asked me to brief you. My name is Mbegezeli Benjamin, and I'm from Judges Matter. And we have, like Zikona said, we have Mone Olivier and Dan Mafura on the panel. Like I asked them, am I allowed to call you Dali? Just
yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, where we are in the conversation, we're just recapping what happened in April in terms of the interviews. And Dan shared with us the concerns that CASAC had when it comes to the interviews that happened in April and why they went to court. Some of the issues that he raised was that the interviews were not conducted properly. There were irrelevant issues that were canvassed during the interview. He says commissioners re-litigated certain of the issues that they had lost in court proceedings, and issues relating to that. And also he raised issues about the process in terms of how certain allegations were put to the candidates, and that there seem to have been irrelevant issues considered. Morne Olivier just added on that track to say that the issue does relate to the criteria or lack thereof that the JSC has when it comes to assessing the fitness of candidates for judicial office. And then he raised another issue about the process, in that certain allegations were put to candidates and it was commissioners themselves who asked the candidate to withdraw versus the candidates themselves searching their souls and volunteering to withdraw. So that's just a quick summary of the issues. Now, how I would have liked the conversation to start is in fact with you, with telling us about what kind of process does the JSC follow when it conducts the interviews. Is there a strategy? Are there certain line of questioning that is followed? To us as observers, we see that the Chief Justice does ask certain of the questions, and then the commissioners are left largely to follow up with the questions. So as a commissioner who's been there for quite some time, could you share with us some of the insights or your insights into how the process goes about? How do the questions come about, and who decides who asks which questions and how?
Okay, yeah, no, thank you very much, colleagues, and apologies again for coming in late here. Look, this is a topic that I suppose we should all be discussing on an ongoing basis, because I think sometimes we tend to forget that we are, even to call us a young democracy is sometimes an exaggeration. We are a baby when it comes to democracies. So some of the issues that we grappled with as a democracy are issues that we should all be grappling with in any event, because we're, at an infancy stage, and we're all learning through trial and error sometimes. And that is how it should be, by the way. I don't think anyone should be alarmed by that. But yeah, having said that, the problem sometimes is that, and that, again, this is not just a matter of the JSC. I think even with us as legal practitioners, you know, once you have lost a case, then you start to think about maybe this is how it should be done. So most of these complaints always come from those who did not succeed. Again, understandably so. I think it happens with tender processes, it happens with examinations and all sorts of things. So we do need a bit of perspective, I think. But coming back to the specific issue of the JSC, there's no magic formula as to who asks what question. Sorry, I think I've lost it. You might have lost my visual, but can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
We have lost your visual. Sorry.
Yes.
But could you please put it on? It's something that I've omitted to say, is that we'll be recording this to package into a short video. So if you could put your visuals on, we'll appreciate it.
I had them on. That's that I was using my phone, so someone was trying to call me. Yeah. Okay. Now, what I was saying, coming specifically to the JSC, there's no magic formula. It's like any other interviewing process, at least that I've been involved in, whether it's interviewing someone for a job or to become an advocate or whatever. So really the format at the level at which you're asking is quite simple. Whoever is chairing, as would happen in any interviewing process, would take charge of the situation and try to get the person comfortable and so on, and then ask their questions and then hand over to the rest of the panel. That's a standard format that is used the world over in interviews which are done by a panel rather than a single person. Secondly, and again, and I'm sure we will see this next week, that the style of the chairperson, I'm 100% sure that when DCJ Zondo is chairing next week, he will introduce some of his own stylistic issues. When Mogoeng CJ was chairing, he prefers to start with his own issues and give to the panel. Someone else might do it the other way around. I don't know. I know I've sat in 1 or 2 interviews with DCJ Zondo when Mogoeng CJ was not available, and so I've already seen what I'm predicting will happen next week. But as far as the rest of the commissioners are concerned, again, there's no limit. Obviously, the issues must be relevant because they must be covered either in the papers, in other words, in the person's application, or just in the mandate of the JSC generally. So, you know, you wouldn't have somebody being asked questions about the soccer match of last weekend, you know, and it might be necessary to have that person warming up.
I want to apologize and just say, like I said to the other panelists, that I will interject a few times, and I hope you don't take it as being rude.
No. Yeah,
but yes, and yes, to manage the time as well. But on this issue that you raised, that similar to other interview processes, HR processes, often those HR processes would have some sort of scoring sheet, which has a criteria or a rubric that you score the candidates with. And I would like to know whether the JSC has something similar, because that also determines the relevance of the issues, the point that you've just come to now, that you can't ask about a soccer match, but what can you not ask about, and who decides what is relevant and what is not, and how is it enforced? If you could just quickly respond to that.
Well, again, okay, I mean, when I use the example of HR, I don't mean it literally, that it is the same as an HR. I'm saying any interview. Like we interview, for example, to become pupil advocates. So or even a court case, you can call it an interview. Whenever there's a panel, there's somebody who's if you go in the Constitutional Court, it's the Chief Justice. If you are in the SCA, it's the presiding judge. That's who directs proceedings or allows people to speak or not to speak or for how long. That's really what I was trying to say here. As far as the JSC is concerned, there is, relevance. Remember, these are senior either judges or MPs or practitioners. Again, the chair, the person who's chairing becomes important because they will obviously, if I can go on for half an hour to a candidate about a soccer match, they will start saying, well, where is this going? Or, let's cap it there. I'm making that as an extreme example. But the reality is that the guide, if you want to be technical, the guide is from the Constitution and the Act, as well as the papers of that particular, the application and the comments, the stuff that the pack, the thing that is in the pack. So the BLA might have said this or that about you, and therefore it must be put to you. Or in a judgment that you have written, there might be some controversial issue, then a commissioner will ask you about that. Why did you decide this that way and not that way, and so on. So the scope is very wide, but it is circumscribed by the instruments that bring us there in the first place, number one. Number two, by the mandates that we get from those of us who represent particular constituencies, that you get from those constituencies, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I want to bring Morne in to respond to what Dali has just raised in terms of the flexibility. Well, he seems to say that there's a flexibility in the scope and the limits of the questions, and commissioners are largely limited by what is on the papers and issues that are relevant. Do you think this is a good way to go about it? Is there a way that you could suggest would still achieve getting good candidates through, but meeting the standards of rigor that we expect from judicial interviews?
Well, questioning is very important because questioning is the only way for the JSC commissioners to determine whether or not the candidate is suitable for appointment. Questioning is such an important component of the interview process that the JSC itself composed certain guidelines. And those guidelines need to form the foundation of any questioning of candidates. And the most important aspect of that is relevance. And Dali raised that. The question is what is relevant and what is not relevant to the particular criteria for appointment. The chairperson plays a very important role in that regard, or in this regard. Dali mentioned different styles, and certainly it is noticeable that Chief Justice Mogoeng does it differently, for example, than his predecessor, CJ Ngobo, and then again his predecessor, who was Langa. Every single CJ seems to have his own approach to running the proceedings. But the most important thing is that questioning needs to be controlled, and those questions need to be relevant. Now, I mean, I've always said that interview length is a problem, and that if questions were perhaps a little bit more focused, then there could be greater fairness in establishing interviews that are of broadly similar length. The problem is that if an interview is too short or an interview perhaps too long, that there are certain issues of perhaps unfair treatment at play. With regard to the specific questions themselves, I think that Dali is correct that the pack as such must form the foundation of the questioning. And it is an essential or a sensible approach I think. For example, the pack will contain the report from the DGRU, which I think is a very, very useful tool to employ. From the judgments, one can ascertain whether or not there's a commitment to constitutional values. One can ascertain whether or not the candidate is technically competent, etc., etc. And if certain specific reservations exist with regard to those aspects, then those can be raised in the interview with the particular candidate. But it is important that a question is based in some source of some kind, and I think that the pack is very useful in that regard. With regard to the issue of questioning, whilst I acknowledge and I agree that questioning is essentially an organic process, and that free flow is quite important. A particular answer to a question may elicit another follow-up question, or it may trigger a question in the mind of another commissioner who would then like to join the conversation. Whilst that is true, I think that perhaps there are a few core questions that need to be posed to candidates before the commissioners move on to a more open freestyle type of questioning. And I think that specifically a set of base questions, perhaps based on the issues canvassed specifically in the questionnaire, could be a good point to start. For example, candidates must list their greatest achievements in law as such, and they could ask specific questions relating to that, and then very importantly, not just answer the question, say these are my greatest accomplishments, but the follow-up to that could be to say, but then how does that link to your suitability for appointment to the particular to the role or to the job which you have applied for? Furthermore, I noticed during this interview round specifically that some of the commissioners limited themselves to a particular type of question. For example, Professor Schlemmer seemed to engage candidates a bit more substantively with regard to the issue of judicial philosophy. Now, I think judicial philosophy is a bit of a pretentious term. I would rather call it approach to judging. And that in itself is another matter which can, or another issue which can, to a large extent, be gauged on the judge, or from the judgments of the particular candidate, and he or she can then expand on the particular question, can address particular issues arising from the judgment, certain concerns that commissioners may have. But I think as a fundamental basis, there needs to be some set of core questions that apply to all candidates. I don't agree with the idea of a kind of scoring sheet, a tick box a system that would be completely inappropriate, considering the importance of the appointment, considering that professionals are involved. We need to consider and focus on substantive questions which produce substantive answers, which goes to the heart of the candidate's suitability for appointment as a judge. That's essentially it.
Yeah, I want to pick up on two issues that you've raised, and I want, Dali, if you could please give us a quick response on this. Monet seems to be against the score sheet that I spoke about earlier, but he seems to support an idea of a set of core or base questions that could be asked to the candidates. In the time that you've been on the JSC, has there ever been an attempt to put together that core set of base questions? If so, where did that project go? If not, do you have any idea why that idea was never explored?
Yeah, no, there are core issues. I mean, the question I suppose would be whether they need to be articulated in some piece of paper. There are obviously core issues, and they come out of every interview that I've ever sat on. And those core issues would be the issue that Mone mentions of judicial philosophy, whichever way you phrase it. There are issues of experience, obviously. There are issues of transformation. There are issues of gender transformation in specifically. The issues of the width of the judicial experience. For example, if somebody has only done criminal work, and again, that would be something that would come out of their pack, then you can put your money that someone is going to ask a question as to, why have you not done civil work, or vice versa. There are certain things that are predictable and form a pattern. It is true, and maybe let me just say in agreement with Monet about the style issue. Even given those core issues which will be covered almost in every interview, there are still going to be issues of style, not just of the chair, but even of the commissioners themselves. I mean, it's quite true that you had somebody like Professor Schlemmer, and I think before her there was Mr. Msomi. Those are just the examples that jump out at me. Those are the kinds of people who will almost ask the same question, almost literally, for the whole week or 2 weeks, but other people might ask completely different issues depending on the engagement with the candidate, and then others might be in between. They might ask one standard question and another one that we might call free-flowing or arising from the discussion. All that, as I say, for me is not surprising. That's exactly why you have those different types of people. If we were all there and asked the same question, same 5 questions, then why should we all be there? There should be one questioner who just asks the 5 questions and ticks the box, and then off you go. And then you do the 7 out of 5 here, 12, and then you're gone. That would be the best. But the entire philosophy of the interviews is exactly to bring that diversity on the part of the questioners themselves. That's why you have academics, advocates, attorneys, MPs, judges, president, what have you. The system is specifically designed to bring that diversity. Was it wide enough? Maybe not. Maybe you should have trade unionists and all sorts of other, I don't know. But as far as you have the variety of interests and persons and personalities that are there, that is exactly it's not a coincidence. It's the intention of the Constitution in defining who should be sitting there. So you can't make it too rigid, but I take the point and I concede the point that also you can't make it like too wide that you can just ask anything that comes to your head. So it's finding that balance really that we should be after.
Okay, I'm just concerned about time, and I do want to bring Dan back into the conversation, and I want to move the conversation a little bit on issues like transformation, for example. I think, Dali, you've raised that transformation is a consideration. There isn't sort of an agreement of what transformation comprises of. Yes, the Constitution speaks about race and gender, but there have been commissioners like Dali, in fact, in the last interview round, who's asked about whether the Section 174 should be amended to accommodate a broader conception of transformation. Now, Dan, considering this tension between rigidity and flexibility, how should the JSC go about dealing with the question of transformation and it practically in how it questions the candidates? How would you as CASAC maybe view the questions around transformation, and how should they be approached with the candidates?
Yeah, so I mean, we don't, I'm certainly speaking for myself, I don't know what the JSC's approach to section 1742 is, right? So it's quite difficult to say this is how things should be done when, or this is how things can be improved on when you don't know how the JSC approaches the question of transformation. So for example, I mean, the Constitution says something like the judiciary must be broadly representative of the racial and gender makeup of the population. So when you consider a candidate, let's say, who is a white man, do you take into consideration the fact that there is no white man on the constitutional court bench, for example, or is the fact that there's a similarly qualified black woman, does that override the absence of a black man, or of a white man? Sorry. Or do you consider, is it a question of proportionality? How many of the judges are black or are women, as in relation to the broader population? Is it a concern, for example, for the JSC that there hasn't been a white woman appointed to the Constitutional Court since 1994? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that I certainly cannot answer from the outside, but there are questions that, having some kind of published criteria, published factors that the JSC would factor into the decision making would certainly enlighten us and give us a bit more insight in how these decisions are ultimately made, and to kind of help us as well weigh up the different candidates against each other based on for example, the needs of that particular court. When you look at the Constitutional Court, we have expanded jurisdiction. They are dealing with a lot more cases. They are dealing with cases that in subject areas that they did not deal with before. How does that factor into the 1742 kind of exercise? And so I'm sorry, Bix, but I don't have an answer for you. I just have more questions following from what you were saying. And I think that really exemplifies, the difficulty that civil society or the broader public have about assessing the performance of the JSC office, excuse me, constitutional functions when there's so much that we are still in the dark about.
Dali, Dan says he can't help us. Maybe you can, especially considering the issue that you're in the room and involved in the deliberations. How should the question of transformation be dealt with? Are you satisfied with how it's currently being dealt with?
No, I'm not. As you correctly pointed out, I made a strong point in the last sitting that one cannot look at transformation through the narrow eyes of gender and race only. I mean, in a country as diverse as South Africa, there are so many other criteria. Even looking at the criteria listed in Section 9 of the Constitution, religion, ethnic origin, and all sorts of things that are there. So I found 174 to be very limiting. But having said that, and I must say, I don't think anybody has really had a resistance to my proposal that I made last time, that there should be an amendment. That's what I was talking about, to say whoever drafted the Constitution, maybe at that time, these were the two big issues that were, well, they still are the two big issues, race and gender. But that does not mean that you should limit it to that, because then you're just going to have diversity in two areas, when diversity can be in 20 or 30 or even unlimited number of ways, including this issue of judicial philosophy. I mean, a person, just because they are black or because they are a woman, will not necessarily have a particular outlook to matters. But let me say this, maybe just to assist in this. I don't think it's correct to say anybody is in the dark as to what the criteria that are used, because again, those are things that are articulated. The problem, in my humble view, is that people with sectional interests always look at a particular, either a particular court or a particular interview or a particular day. And you can't judge something like the JSC like that. It's just absurd to do that. If you really want to assess the JSC, you're going to have to look at a cross-section over, say, 2 or 3 interview sessions, or even 1 interview session. You can't say, because otherwise you'll be schizophrenic, because on one day we might appoint 3 white women, and then you say, oh, the JSC likes white women. And then the following day we'll be appointing black men. And then, oh, no, today the JSC likes black men, and another, or whatever. It doesn't work like that. You have to look at the entire experience of let's say, an interview session. Because even from one court to another, we might do some things that look completely crazy if you look at it narrowly. Because you'll say, well, in this case, there were 3 white people and 2, and then they got 1 of each. But the next interview, you'll have exactly that same ratio, but the outcome will be different because there's no formulastic way of doing it or box ticking. Yeah, it's a question of looking at the other issue is that it's a democratic system. Again, somebody once said, democracy is the best system because if you look at the alternatives. Now, the issue is that ultimately, it has, we try to avoid it, obviously, but ultimately it has to come to voting. So in the end, the person who's got the highest number of commissioners supporting them will be the person who goes through. And that number, so you might get 15 votes as yourself, Mbeki, and of those 15 votes, 2 might be because, and I'm exaggerating for effect, because of the suit you are wearing. 1 might be because of some answer you gave. 3 other votes might be because of the answer you did not give. Another 4 votes might be because the other candidates were worse than you, not necessarily that you were the greatest, and so on. It's a variety of things that cannot be measured cannot be calibrated, with a fine-tooth comb. It might even be because you went in the morning, you get 1 extra vote than someone else because, or this particular commissioner happened not to be there. It happens like that in real life. So someone might be, there's a threshold, for example, of 13 votes. So you might have come in at 12 votes, or you might have come in at 2, but both of you'll be told you didn't make it. You know what I mean? But that didn't make it means completely different things to different people, as it were. Yeah.
Okay, and Moni, I want to bring you on this last issue on how the JSC should go about doing its job. And I think throughout the conversation, we've sort of lifted this issue out, and I don't see agreement on like a set criteria, but there seems to be some conversions around having some sort of a structure or guide on how this should be done. Now, having observed the interviews for quite some time, which is what I think Dali criticizes, that you can't look at it narrowly, you have to look at it over a number of years. Do you think that the JSC, in terms of its focus on the issues, on the qualities that matter, is there sufficient focus on that? And if you could advise the JSC, what kind of qualities would you highlight as being some of the most important when it comes to considering a candidate?
Yeah, well, I suppose that's $1 million question, isn't it? I think one of the most important considerations is that whatever sub-criteria is developed must be in line with the 2 general constitutional criteria, namely appropriately qualified, and then fit and proper. I think that there are certain basic criteria that everyone is agreed on and that needs to be canvassed with each and every candidate, and commissioners need to satisfy themselves that that the specific candidate actually meets these particular criteria. I think most importantly is an established track record of judicial excellence. I mean, and that relates to the merit requirement, first and foremost. And this is something that can be gauged from the judgments of the particular individual. Now, as we know, acting has essentially become a requirement for consideration, for shortlisting. I mean, with the exception of two of the recent candidates for the Constitutional Court, almost every judge or every candidate for a particular vacancy in a particular court has in fact acted in that particular court. And so for most, the overwhelming majority of candidates, there would be a judicial track record, which then needs to be interrogated in order to establish whether or not this candidate meets the requirement of judicial excellence. Now, part of judicial excellence is a good or excellent even overall knowledge of the law. And here I'm specifically referring to the Constitutional Court, because as you mentioned earlier, the fact is that the Constitutional Court is no longer only the Constitutional Court as such. Its jurisdiction was expanded. It is now actually the apex court. And so a more general knowledge of the law is perhaps required. I know that Judge Kachalia of the SCA wrote an article in Advocate in which he lamented the fact that the JSC does not pose specific content-based questions to particular candidates. And he did so in a particular interview round where he represented the president of the Supreme Court of Appeal, and he recalls that some of the colleagues on the JSC objected to that particular line of questioning. Now, I think it is important that one must establish whether or not the candidate has an appropriate knowledge of law, but there are different ways of going about it. Importantly, the candidate must be impartial and have independence of mind. Now, independence of mind means that, for example, in a collegial court like the Constitutional Court, that the person must be part of a group, but he must also be able to make up his own mind. And if he feels that, I cannot be part of the majority opinion, and in this particular case, I need to write a minority opinion, then he must do so, and he must have the independence of mind to do that. But the mind must be open to persuasion. It must not be fettered in any possible way. That person must exhibit that he or she has a mind that is open to persuasion. In a court like the Constitutional Court, I think that collegiality is particularly important. Collegiality perhaps is something that is difficult to establish unless the particular candidate had acted as part of a panel before. But collegiality is different from sitting as collegiality in a panel court is qualitatively different from presiding in a court as a single judge, for example. In court, if you're a single judge, you run the show. If you're part of a panel such as the Constitutional Court, you do not run the show. You wait for your opportunity to ask a particular question. You are part of a group of 11 that must listen to legal argument and then make a decision based on what you hear. Within the transformation paradigm, of course, commitment to constitutional values and ability to give expression to constitutional values is very important, and this again can be gauged from judgments. I think that if you have an established judicial track record, then it is easier to determine your commitment to constitutional values as such by examining your approach to adjudication. Because if you favor interpretations that advance the transformation project, then that is a greater indication of a commitment to constitutional values than one which inhibits as such transformational society. I need to hasten to add there that I'm not advocating judicial activism. When I'm talking about advancing transformation agenda, I'm talking within the confines of accepted theories of interpretation. I'm very cognizant of the need for diversity and the application of 1742. It's a constitutional imperative, and it is one that was extremely relevant and extremely necessary at the beginning of the new constitutional order. Things are better now. They're still not where they need to be, but perhaps the time has come for us to look at a broader conception of diversity. As Dali, in fact, mentioned, this whole idea of a more balanced reading of subsection 2, whereby the judiciary should be composed of members of different social groups. So not just a question of race and gender, but you look beyond group-based differences to individual differences as well. And that would be, differences in attitudes, differences in life experience, different approaches to adjudication, like I said, but also different career paths, because I think that is really important. There's a diversity as a former academic, now practitioner, and a former acting judge. I can tell you that the perspective that you bring as an academic to judging, and the perspective that you bring to practice, I think is unique, and it adds value to the judicial function. So diversity needs to be seen within a broader paradigm as such. It needs to be an exercise that ensures that we have people on the bench who understand what the needs are of society, and essentially through their life experience, through their professional experience, is able to ensure that the constitutional promises are in fact realized.
Okay. You speak of judicial activism as a swear word. You imply at least. Now, I wanted, so the qualities that you've raised judicial excellence, independence of mind, a transformative outlook to judging, issues of transformation and diversity. Now, all of these issues, I think, are important qualities that must come up. But I wonder, how does the JSC, or how should the JSC make sure that all of these issues are interrogated? And this question I'd like to put to you, Dan, and I think, Dali, you can follow up based on your experiences sitting in the JSC. But the real question, the narrow question I want to ask is, what should the role of the different commissioners be when it comes to issues such as this? For example, on questions of diversity, there's been, I think it was Commissioner Malema, who used to ask a question about, does the candidate speak an African language, and why they have not tried to speak an African language. So I'd really like to ask you, Dan, what do you see the role of the different commissioners being? And do you think that the JSC is too big, as some people say?
Right. So I think Morne covered a lot of ground in the previous answer. And certainly I agree with much of what he said about the qualities that a judicial officer needs to have. I think the one thing that has been missing is what Morne mentioned earlier, is the kind of technical content-based questioning, right? So for officers or for candidates who are going on to more generalist courts like the SCA or the Constitutional Court, you need a breadth of experience in all these areas, and you need to be able to demonstrate that. But where, is there space for, say, an academic or a practitioner with particular experience in an area to put a question that speaks to or seeks to uncover the knowledge of the candidate on issues of law? And I think as well, the question about, do you speak an African language? How close are you to the communities that you will be serving is an important question. For example, when you are applying to the High Court, where you will have to run trials, criminal trials at some point. Some witnesses do not speak English. Sometimes, translations and interpretations are different based on what kind of interpreter you have, but are you able as a judicial officer to pick up, on a mistranslation or a misinterpretation of what the witness is saying? Because that is an important aspect of delivering justice, is that you are able to understand the people that are in your court, even just at a human level, to be able to dispense justice in a way that connects to them in that way. So certainly, I'm not sure. I haven't really thought about the structure or the composition of the JSC that much. So far, no complaints, but I do think that we could get a diverse range of questions given the kinds of people who are on the JSC. We should start feeling or experiencing the different aspects of the legal profession, and not just kind of like, as everyone has mentioned today, asking the same question over and over and over. Is there a way to kind of like be dynamic, start from the candidate's experience or their personal life, their career, and then move into the more social questions of diversity, commitment to transformation and things like that, and then into more content-based technical questions about their competence in specific areas of law. For example, when you're going to be sitting in the KZN court or the Western Cape High Court, you at some point may have to deal with maritime or questions of maritime law. Is there that capacity? Is there that competence? So yes, I do think that diversity does have to include a lot more than just race and gender. And I do think that the wide range of professionals, legal professionals that make up the JSC, each have a very valuable role to play, and that we should start seeing a lot more of that.
And okay. I'm just cognizant of time and I don't have much remaining. Dali, could you help us answer this question about what the role of the different commissioners should be? And I want to add a small sub-question to that, is that you and Advocate Jenny Kane, you come as JCB representatives. Do you ever get a chance to confer or caucus before you go into the meeting? And do other commissioners do the same? Does the JSC as a body workshop the kind of issues or the kind of needs that a particular court has? For example, if you're wanting judges to be appointed in Gqeberha, do you sit and discuss the needs of that particular court, which will guide the kind of issues that you canvass with the candidates that are coming up?
Yeah, no, okay, let me start with that last question. You see, that's why all these things are really accommodated in a way by the composition of the JSC. That is why if we're going to interview someone who's going to sit in a court in Gqeberha, for that particular panel, you're going to have the Premier of the Eastern Cape among the people who are sitting there, and you're going to have the Judge President of the Eastern Cape, right? That's the reason, that's the exact reason for that, for that. Of course, the questioning will also be focused, but knowing that there's a generalist slant, but there will also be a specific or localized slant by definition, because of that's why the composition is kind of tailored for a particular interview. Right. Now, as for conferring, yes, of course, the people who come from the same constituency will confer, but they don't have to agree on every candidate again, and I think that's a good thing. But there might be policy issues that affect, let's say, for example, an issue arises within the JSC, not even in interviews, just in the normal JSC meeting, that affects advocates per se, then obviously Jenny and I will kind of represent our constituency, broadly speaking. The attorneys will do the same, the MPs will do the same, the JPs will do the same, and so on and so on. But I just want to get into this issue of diverse criteria. My big thing, for example, is about ideological orientation. Now, that may mean a whole lot of things, but nobody actually looks at the fact that we have a judiciary of elitist people, let me put it that way. Or, there's nobody even bothers to say, is there the voice of the working class, the voice of the youth, the voice of LGBTQI plus people, and all those kinds of things. There's so many criteria which get neglected because sometimes maybe we're overly fixated for good reasons on race and gender. So that's really has been my cry on the issue of the constitutional amendment that I was advocating. The other issue is that, I sometimes get concerned myself, even sitting as a commissioner, that the interview is not tailored, not in the geographic way that you are talking about, but even for the position. So you'll find sometimes it happens that there's an interview about a judge presidentship, but the interview somehow will go into all sorts of things about a particular judgment that this judge gave. And I try as much as I can not to do that. And I because I know when I feel that discomfort, that this might be all very interesting, whatever is being debated with this candidate. But what has it got to do with whether they have the leadership capacity to be a judge president, for example, the issues that Monet was talking about, the leadership qualities, the collegiality, and so on, might be more pronounced for a particular position than for another position. If you're going to be an ordinary judge, maybe that's not such a big issue. But if you're going to be in a panel, if you are contesting for a position in the SCA or the Constitutional Court, that might have to take more prominence. So there's no doubt that there is room for that kind of nuancing in the questioning. And sometimes, people, and that's why it's wrong to have one standard question, because you may have a question about judicial philosophy, which might actually not be relevant, because the person might have a judicial pedigree that is undoubted, but they might make the worst leader that you can ever imagine. So,
but what about, I'm sorry to interject, but what about subcategorization of the criteria? So you'll have general criteria, and then you'll have criteria for the Constitutional Court, for the Supreme Court of Appeal, for leadership positions. Wouldn't that framework work? And then also accommodating some of the transformation needs that you identified. Short of a constitutional amendment, can the JSC not, within its own powers, within the policy-making power that it has, can it not come up with some of a subcategorization of questions or criteria that relate to some of the issues you raised?
Yeah, okay. Again, the answer lies in what I was saying, that that subcategorization, as you call it, is also inbuilt, in the sense that the reason why you're going to have the head of the SCA participating and even taking a leading role when we are interviewing for the SCA is exactly for that. Because I, coming as a representative of the advocacy profession, I might not know the particular weaknesses in the SCA. Right now, they might say, hey, we need a maritime lawyer or whatever. So that subcategorization comes from the composition of the and the fact that there's due deference, if you like, to the local people, to the JPs, and to the even to the premiers for those specific issues. But at the same time, I always do that. I mean, when we have Mogoeng's thing was about 2 questions, not more than 2 questions. Now, sometimes it goes more than that. But at least if you followed my questioning, you'll see that I do that almost deliberately, maybe not all the time. The one question might be about what you call subcategorization, and the other one might be much more general and nothing to do with the specific province that you come from. And let me just say this, for example, it's not true. I think it's unfair criticism to say that we don't ask content-based questions. That is certainly not true, at least not in my experience. I mean, I remember there's one candidate that I asked specifically, and probably the shortest questioning I ever had was to ask a particular person to say, look, forget about all this theoretical stuff. If you are sitting in urgent court tomorrow and this and that case comes, what are you going to do? And the person specifically said, look, I don't know. You literally almost saying, you got me. So there are questions like that. And the criticism that we had of Kachalia J.A. was not because he was asking, as it happens, I'm the person that he was subtweeting when he said people were averse to his questioning, because I raised it openly. The question, my objection to his questioning was not that he's asking content-based questions. It was because he was elevating the so-called commercial experience issue above other issues. And I said, I don't mind him asking about commercial experience, but I wish somebody else would be as much concerned to say to candidates, do you have criminal law experience, for example? Because that's also important. It might not be important for the big business people, but it's important for litigants. So I would be as uncomfortable as Kachalia J.A. might be of having a constitutional court judge who doesn't have commercial experience, in having one who doesn't have experience of criminal law or RAF or the areas of law that are looked down upon. So it's not a question of content based. It's what content based questions are you asking?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just looking at the time now. If it was according to me, we'll spend the whole day debating these issues. But I'd like to thank you for now, and I'll hand over to Zikona, who'll do a wrap up for us, and then we can adjourn. But thank you so much for engaging me.
Before we conclude, can I ask one question of Dali, please?
Sure.
Yes, go ahead.
I've always wondered whether or not it might not be useful to have a general orientation session for new commissioners. Is there such an arrangement in place? Sitting on the JSC is pretty specialized, and I think one needs special skills. It requires a lot of preparation. Formulation of questions is challenging. Is there any support offered to new commissioners in order to prepare themselves to sit as commissioners on the JSC?
Yes, no, that's a very good question, and it's one that has been raised. And fortunately, you are asking it at the right time. Yeah, in 48 hours exactly, there's going to be an induction session of new commissioners for the reasons that you mentioned. Most, particularly new commissioners, always ask for this, and I think you're quite right. It's something that should almost be standardized. And I think some of the issues that have been raised here, I've made notes about, need to be raised in those kinds of sessions, because it does help to have that kind of uniformity, at a level, not necessarily prescribing what question should be asked, but formatting the duration of the questioning, the kinds of issues that we've raised here. Yeah, no, the short answer is yes. There's always, even informally, if someone kind of strays away, when we have lunch, we kind of counsel each other, say, no, maybe you shouldn't have done that. Other people who are more open-minded even ask themselves, did I do that right? Did I cross the line, and so on? But yeah, there is an effort to formalize it.
Thank you so much for that. Before I close off, I'd like to just ask Chris to summarize the discussion that we've had, and then I will close off the webinar.
Thanks, Sekona. I realized that you weren't in the message that I actually just sent to Bex, where I suggested that in the interests of time and to allow everyone to speak, that we should perhaps forego that. But just if I can very briefly say that having watched the JSC for a long time, for over a decade, I think this conversation was extremely important, was extremely timely, and I think really quite encouraging. I mean, Dali's last point about induction for new commissioners, I think is a really valuable one, and one that from the outside we weren't aware was taking place. I think we had a really important and in-depth dive into the question of criteria, which has been an issue that we've long raised and talked about over the years. And I think that conversation was very helpful there. And yeah, just to say, let's hope that this foreshadows a smoother round of interviews next week than was the case in April. And thank you all very much for your contributions.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. And just to add on what you've just said, I think there are two things that we can take out of this webinar. The first is that obviously the JSC interviews cannot be conducted in a free style manner. And at the same time, the JSC interviews cannot be conducted in a tick box exercise kind of style as well, which means that our views are not so opposed, and we should be able to reach common ground. And I'm hoping that we will see the JSC conducting the interviews next week in perhaps a different kind of way that will not lead to any litigation. And as Chris has said, Advocate Mpofu, we are very pleased to hear that the JSC will be having an induction taking place for the new commissioners. But to close off, thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you, Dan Mafora, thank you, Advocate Mpofu, and Monet Olivier for your time. And we are hoping that we can have this webinar at some point after the JSC interviews, just to reflect on what will transpire next week. So just be on the lookout for a second invite. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yes, bye everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yes.
bye.